Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The air was dry and sharp, the kind that May would crack and lips split. Noon light spread across the cabin's yard, showing every nail in the fence and every weed that pushed up through the dust. The widow stepped out onto her porch with a tin dipper in her hand, her movements careful, almost stiff, as if she had grown used to conserving effort for only what was necessary. 10 years of solitude had carved habits into her, closing doors quietly, carrying water in measured amounts, speaking to no one but herself. Her name was Clara Redfield. Once she had been the wife of a small rancher, a man who believed hard work and honesty would be enough to keep them safe. That ended the night outlaws came, tied him with rope from their own barn, and left him bleeding in the yard. No posse formed, no justice carried out. Since then, she had chosen to live apart, guarding her grief like property. She managed a garden, a few hens, and one cow, enough to survive but never enough to feel secure. The town knew her, but only as a shadow at the store counter or as the woman who never stayed long in church. Her eyes caught movement near the fence line. He was there again, the cowboy, same as he had been for years. He wasn't trespassing, not really, always standing just far enough that she could not accuse him of intrusion. But he was close enough to remind her that she wasn't invisible. His name was Daniel Hayes. Folks in town didn't know much about him, and he did little to change that. He worked odd jobs, drifted along the edge of ranch crews, and kept his words short. There had been talk that he'd once ridden with the wrong kind of men down south, but it was never proven. What Clara knew was this. He was steady, and he was always there, watching from the same distance. At first, his presence had felt like a threat. She remembered the tightening in her chest when she noticed him back then, the thought that maybe he was measuring her for weakness like the men who had taken her husband. But the years were those fears down. He never stepped closer, never spoke, never tried to force himself into her space. Just watched. And strangely, that watchfulness had started to feel less like a knife at her back and more like a silent guard at the edge of her world. Still, her hand shook as she lifted the dipper. She caught the tremor and clenched her jaw to steady it. A woman living alone on the frontier couldn't afford fear. But today something shifted. The loneliness had grown heavier than her grief. She felt the weight of silence pressing against her walls, and the sight of him standing there once again, silent, patient, unchanging, was too much to ignore. Her voice came out lower than she expected, rough with disuse. "I see you watching. Why don't you come closer?" The words hung in the air. She could feel her heart thudding against her ribs, half with dread, half with relief at having finally spoken. She realized that what she feared most was not that he would cross the fence, but that he would turn away. Daniel didn't turn away. He stood still for a long moment, and she saw his hand tighten slightly against his belt as though deciding whether to respect the line he had kept for 10 years. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The crunch of his boots on dry earth sounded louder than the cicadas in the grass. He walked straight and slow, not rushing, not apologizing. When he reached her porch, he stopped and removed his hat, revealing lines carved deep around his eyes. Lines not just from sun, but from years of carrying things he didn't speak of. Clara stepped back and pushed the cabin door open wider, her breath caught between nerves and curiosity. She turned and set the dipper down beside the clay jug inside, the cool water sweating against its surface. Daniel wiped his boots at the threshold without being told. Then he entered the cabin for the first time. The room was plain, but it bore the marks of a woman who had survived alone. Every tool had its place. The broom leaned against the doorframe, bristles worn down. A folded blanket rested on a chair that hadn't been sat in for months. The iron skillet on the stove still carried the smell of yesterday's beans. She saw his eyes take in everything without judgment. When she offered him the dipper of water, their hands didn't touch. Yet the air between them felt charged, as if 10 years of silence had finally condensed into this small, ordinary act. Daniel drank slowly, then set the dipper down on the table. Clara stood across from him, her palms damp against her dress. Neither spoke. Both felt the strain of years lived apart, the mistrust, the loss, the need for something more than solitude. The silence that filled the cabin wasn't empty. It was alive, heavy with fear, stress, and a thin thread of empathy neither of them dared name yet. For the first time in a decade, Clara realized she was no longer alone. The cabin was small, one room with walls darkened by years of fire smoke, but Daniel moved with care, as if he understood this space had been guarded for a long time. He set his hat down on the edge of the table, not on her chair, not near the stove, as though he knew she would measure where he placed things. Clara stood across from him, arms crossed lightly at her waist, unsure of whether to speak or wait. The silence that had always separated them now felt sharper, because inside the cabin there was nowhere else to look. She thought of what people might ask if they could see this moment. Why let him in now, after all this time? Why trust him? The truth was simple. She didn't trust him yet, but she was tired of silence, and his years of watchfulness had proven something. If he had meant harm, he'd had 100 chances. Her choice to open the door had been less about him and more about what she could no longer endure. Another summer of days without a human voice crossing her walls. Daniel seemed to sense her unease. He drank from the dipper, set it down gently, then said, "Your door hinge is loose. Drags at the bottom when it shuts." His tone was steady, without judgment, but it startled her. 10 years, and that was his first real sentence directed at her. She swallowed before answering, her throat dry despite the water. "It's been like that for months. I make do." He glanced toward the hinge, then back to her. "It won't hold another winter. I've got a driver and screws in my bag." For a moment, she felt a flare of tension. Should she let him touch the door, part of the house that had kept her safe? Then she looked at the frame, remembered how many nights she had lain awake listening for sounds outside, thinking about how that sagging hinge could give way if pushed hard enough. Her heart eased just slightly. "If you think you can fix it, go ahead." He nodded once, not as a man who had won ground, but as someone who had expected her to decide for herself. He stepped outside, came back with a small leather tool roll, and crouched at the door. She watched him work. His hands were sure, the movements precise, but not careless. He set one screw straight, tested the swing, shaved the frame with a small blade until the door closed clean. He didn't explain what he was doing. He didn't need to. She found herself focusing on the rhythm of his actions, the quiet scrape of wood, the turn of the driver. It struck her then that she knew almost nothing about him beyond the rumors. A drifter, once rode with the wrong men, worked ranch crews when needed. She realized the listeners, too, would wonder, who is this man really? Why stay near her all these years? When he finished, he stood and stepped back, testing the door one final time. It closed without a sound. "It'll hold now," he said simply. Clara looked at the door and felt something she hadn't felt in years: relief. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out softer than she intended. He set the driver back into his role and said, "You shouldn't have to hold everything together by yourself." The sentence struck her deeper than she wanted to admit. She had built her life on proving she could do everything alone, but the weight of it had left her raw. Her mind darted back to the night her husband died, to the way the men in town had refused to come help bury him. That was when she learned that relying on others came with disappointment too sharp to bear. Still, she studied Daniel's face as he rolled the tools, noticing the lines around his eyes that spoke of exhaustion more than age. "Why were you always there?" she asked, the question rising before she could stop it. He met her gaze. For a moment, his jaw tightened, as if he wanted to give nothing away. But then he said, "A man notices when someone's left alone. I figured if trouble ever came back, someone ought to be close enough to see." She heard no flattery in it, no attempt to earn favor. Just fact. That honesty unsettled her, but it also steadied her. The afternoon sun angled across the floorboards. She felt a pang of worry, wondering what the townsfolk might say if word spread he had stepped inside. Yet another thought pressed harder. Maybe for once I don't care what they say. The silence returned, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a pause where something else could grow. Clara poured him another dipper of water. "You can sit if you want," she said. Daniel pulled out the chair across from hers and lowered himself slowly, as if measuring whether his presence fit in the space. Neither of them spoke further, but the small sound of the repaired door closing clean behind them marked the beginning of something new, fragile, uncertain, but real. The cabin settled into a silence that felt different from the long years of quiet Clara had grown used to. This silence carried another presence, a weight that wasn't only hers anymore. Daniel sat at the table with his hands resting on the wood, his hat on his knee, his eyes moving from the stove to the shelves to the window, as if taking in the whole space with care. Clara sat opposite him, her palms flat against her dress, telling herself not to fidget. She felt restless, but she wasn't sure if it was fear or relief. The question that had hung on her mind since he crossed the threshold still burned. Why her? Why stay near her all these years when there were other ranches, other towns, other women? People listening to her story would ask the same thing. She decided she couldn't let it hang any longer. "You said you stayed close in case trouble came back," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "But why me? Why not someone else?" Daniel's eyes shifted to her and held there. He didn't answer quickly. Instead, he took in a slow breath, his jaw tightening as if choosing each word cost him something. "Because I saw what was done to you," he said at last. "Most folks turned away after that night. I didn't. Maybe I should have come closer sooner. But I figured standing watch was better than leaving you with no one at all." The words hit her like a blunt truth. She thought of the night she buried her husband alone, the way the men in town had found excuses not to help. Rage had burned through her then, followed by years of silence, years of convincing herself she needed nothing. But the idea that someone had stood by, even from a distance, chipped at the wall she had built. She didn't know if she should feel grateful or resentful. "You watched me for 10 years, she said slowly. "Did you ever think I'd notice?" Daniel lowered his eyes for the first time, his thumb running over the edge of his hat brim. "I thought maybe you already had. I didn't think you'd ever speak to me, though. I just figured if I kept my distance, you could decide on your own terms." Clara leaned back in her chair, studying him. He wasn't a man who seemed to chase after anything. His tone carried no demand, no expectation. But the thought struck her that maybe he wasn't just protecting her. Maybe he carried his own reasons for standing out there. "What about you?" she asked suddenly. "What were you running from?" His head lifted, his gaze steady now. He didn't flinch at the question, though a muscle ticked at his jaw. "I've worked cattle, drifted, made mistakes. Some men I rode with years ago, they didn't care who they hurt. I left before I became like them. After that, I stayed clear of crews that smelled wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want a clean line. Watching over you, it gave me one." Clara absorbed this in silence. The listeners of this story would wonder about his past, about whether he was trustworthy, about whether she was letting in another kind of danger. She asked herself the same, but she also knew the truth. He had had a decade to harm her if that had been his intent, and he hadn't. Her chest tightened as she realized how long it had been since she'd let herself believe in the possibility of another person's steadiness. Outside, the sound of a chicken scratching near the porch broke the stillness. Clara rose, partly to give herself space from the weight of the conversation. She stepped outside, Daniel following at a respectful distance. The corral stood crooked, one of the posts loose from the last freeze. She'd patched it herself with rope, but it leaned badly. Daniel noticed immediately. "That won't hold a strong push," he said. "I've managed," Clara answered, her tone defensive though she knew he was right. "Let me help you set it straight," he said simply. She hesitated. Letting him inside her cabin was one thing. Letting him put his hands on her land was another. But then she remembered the questions that listeners would ask. How could a woman alone keep her place for so long? How did she manage all the work? The truth was that she had managed, but barely. Her body bore the proof in scars, aches, and nights where she fell into bed too tired to sleep. She exhaled slowly. "All right, but we do it together." Daniel gave one small nod, then fetched a length of wood and a spade from his saddlebag. They worked side by side, tamping dirt around the post, bracing it until it stood firm. The rhythm of the work eased some of her nerves. For the first time in years, she felt the strain of a task lesson under another pair of hands. When it was done, They stood back, dust clinging to their skin, and she saw him wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Clara brought out more water from the jug, poured it into the dipper, and handed it to him. This time their fingers brushed. It was a small touch, accidental, but she didn't pull away quickly. Neither did he. The moment passed, but it left a trace of heat behind. As they sat under the eaves with the repaired fence steady before them, Clara realized the story had shifted. She wasn't just the widow who survived. He wasn't just the drifter who watched. Together, there was something unspoken, fragile, and beginning. The questions that had haunted her, why he stayed, what he wanted, whether she was still capable of trust, were not gone, but they no longer gnawed at her in the same way. For now, the answers felt less important than the simple fact that she was not facing the silence alone. The following morning, the sun climbed fast, the kind of heat that warned the day would not be easy. Clara stood at the porch with a list forming in her head. Flour, coffee, salt, and lamp oil were nearly gone. She had stretched her stores as far as she could, but the shelves were thinning, and even a woman determined to keep her distance from town couldn't ignore it forever. Daniel, already outside checking his horse, looked up when she stepped off the porch with her basket in hand. "You're heading in?" he asked. She hesitated. For 10 years she had made the ride alone, keeping her visits short, speaking little, giving no one reason to linger near her. But now the thought of walking into that store alone made her stomach tighten. Everyone in town knew her face. They'd notice if she came back with someone at her side. They'd whisper. And still, she didn't want to face the ride back with only silence for company. "I need supplies," she said plainly. "You coming or not?" Daniel didn't argue, didn't ask if she was sure. He just cinched his saddle and said, "I'll ride with you." The ride into town was quiet. Clara kept her eyes on the dust that rose from her horse's hooves. Daniel rode slightly behind her at first, giving her space, then even with her when the trail narrowed. She wondered if he knew the questions that would hang in the air once they were seen together. People listening to this story would certainly ask, how did the town react? What would neighbors think of the widow letting a man into her life after so many years? She braced herself for the answers before they even reached the main street. The town was as it always was, horses tied outside the saloon, a wagon stacked with hay bales, children darting across the dirt road with a rag ball. But Clara felt every eye slide toward her as she rode past, Daniel steady at her side. She kept her face neutral, her back straight, as if she didn't notice. Inside, her pulse hammered. At the store, she pushed the door open, the bell above it clinking. The clerk, Mr. Jensen, looked up from his ledger, eyebrows rising just slightly when he saw who came in behind her. He said nothing, only wiped his hands on his apron. Clara asked for flour, coffee, salt, and lamp oil, her voice even. While the clerk measured out the goods, two women near the cloth bolts exchanged glances. Their whispers were low, but not low enough. 10 years alone, and now she brings someone in, one murmured. "Some men don't mind picking over what's left," the other replied. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn her head. She'd lived long enough to know small-town words could cut deeper than knives, but showing that they cut was worse. Daniel stood near the barrel of nails, arms loose at his sides, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. If he heard, he gave no sign. His stillness was almost defiant, the kind that said he would not play into anyone else's judgment. The deputy stepped in just as Clara was paying. He tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am, sir, fine day for it." His tone was courteous but edged with curiosity. Clara knew what he was really asking. "What are you doing together?" She met his gaze evenly. "Fine day," she answered, nothing more. With supplies loaded in her basket, she and Daniel stepped back into the light. The murmurs followed them out, but no one spoke directly. Clara mounted her horse, her hands stiff on the reins. As they rode away, her chest burned with the weight of what she hadn't said, what she hadn't allowed herself to show in front of those watching. It wasn't until they reached the creek outside town that she slowed her horse and finally let the words out. "They'll talk," she said flatly, "until they've worn themselves out." Daniel let his reins slack so his horse could lower its head to the water. Let them, he said. Talk never broke a fence post. It never fed a horse. Doesn't mean a thing unless you carry it home with you. She looked at him, caught by the calm in his tone. He wasn't naive. His face bore too many years, too many lines for that. But he seemed untouched by the sting of gossip. For a moment, she envied it, then realized maybe she needed it. As they sat by the creek, she noticed how naturally he had stepped into the role of company without pressing himself further. That raised another question, one that listeners, too, would demand. What exactly did he want from her? Was this duty, friendship, or was something more? Clara drew a breath. Why are you really here, Daniel? Not just at the fence. Not just today. Why stay with me? He glanced at her, water glinting behind him. Because you let me, he answered simply, and because I don't plan to walk off now. The plainness of it left her without words. For the first time in a long while, she felt the tension in her chest ease, if only slightly. The town might talk, but here, by the water, there was no judgment. Just two people who had decided the silence was easier to bear together. The ride back from town carried a weight Clara couldn't shake. The words whispered behind her back still rang in her ears, even though she had shown no reaction at the time. 10 years of silence had made her strong on the outside, but she knew listeners to her story would ask the same question she now asked herself. Why does it still sting after all this time? She had endured far worse than gossip. Yet the truth was simple. When people reminded her of her isolation, it cut open wounds she had spent years trying to close. When they reached the cabin, clouds were gathering over the western ridge. The air smelled of rain. Clara moved quickly, bringing her basket inside, while Daniel checked the sky. Storm's coming, he said, tying his horse under the lean-to. By the time the first drops fell, they were both inside, the door newly repaired and holding against the sudden gusts. The storm came down hard, rattling the walls, water hammering the roof. Clara lit a lamp, set it low on the table, and sat across from Daniel while the thunder rolled. The storm trapped them together, and the silence inside was heavy, though not hostile. Clara could feel a question pressing forward, one she had never spoken aloud in 10 years. Why did no one help me when my husband died? Why did the town turn away? She realized the listeners would demand to know, too, and that this truth had a surface now. She looked at Daniel, her hands twisting in her lap. You said you saw what happened back then. How much did you see? He met her eyes without flinching. Enough to know it wasn't fair. Enough to know no one came when you needed them. Her throat tightened, and the words pushed out before she could stop them. They tied his hands with a rope from our own barn. Shot him by the trough like he was nothing. I begged the men from town to come help bury him. They wouldn't. Said the ground was too wet, that they had their own work. So I dug the grave myself before the earth hardened. Her voice broke on the last word, but she steadied it, refusing to cry. She had trained herself not to break in front of anyone. But now, with the storm outside and Daniel watching her without pity, she felt the truth land heavier than it had in years. Daniel's voice came quiet, steady. I'm sorry I wasn't there. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a promise, just a plain acknowledgement. And somehow, it eased her chest more than empty sympathy would have. She looked down at the table, tracing a crack in the wood with her finger, and whispered, That's why I stopped trusting people. That's why I stayed alone. If the town wouldn't stand with me then, I didn't need them after. Daniel didn't argue. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes steady. You kept it all standing alone. That says more about you than anything they said behind your back today. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to hear those words as truth. She had survived. Not perfectly, not without scars, but she had survived. And now she was letting someone in, though it frightened her. Listeners might wonder, was she ready to risk trust again, to let her guard down after so long? Clara didn't know the answer herself. The storm passed slowly. When the rain softened, they stepped outside together to check the yard. The trough still held water. The fence stood solid from their work the day before. Clara ran her hand along the wood, her palm wet from the rain. Daniel stood beside her, scanning the ridge as if expecting riders to appear. Does it get easier? She asked suddenly, not looking at him. What? Carrying what you've done or what you've lost. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "It doesn't get easier, but it gets quieter, if you let it." She turned toward him then, studying his face. She could see the truth in his words, the kind of truth that only came from someone who had lived with it too. She didn't press for details, though listeners might wonder about his past as much as hers. That, she sensed, would come in its own time. As the last of the rain dripped from the eaves, Clara realized she had taken a step she never thought she would. She had spoken her husband's death aloud, in full, to another person, and the world had not collapsed. If anything, it felt lighter. Daniel had not walked away. The silence between them, as they returned inside, no longer felt heavy with secrets. It felt steady, like ground that might hold if she dared to step forward again. The morning after the storm broke clear, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth. Clara moved around the cabin, resetting what the wind had shifted, while Daniel repaired the shed door that had blown loose. For a time, their work filled the silence, but Clara's mind kept circling back to something she hadn't asked. The listeners of her story would wonder the same. Who exactly was this man she had let into her home? Why had he stayed near her for so long? And what shadows from his past followed him still? She wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward him. "You know almost everything about me now," she said, steady but firm. "But I know nothing about you, Daniel. People in town have whispered. Some say you rode with rough men. Is it true?" He stopped what he was doing, the hammer in his hand, pausing mid-swing. For a moment, he seemed to measure whether to answer at all. Then he set the hammer down carefully, straightened his shoulders, and faced her. His eyes held hers without slipping away. "Yes, it's true. Years back, I rode with a crew 4 counties south. Cattle work mostly, but not all of it was honest. Men like that, they take what they want. I stayed too long before I saw what they really were." Clara's chest tightened, but she didn't move. She needed to hear it. "And what made you leave?" His jaw flexed once, the memory pulling at him. A farmer tried to close a gate on land they didn't have rights to cross. One of the men shot him. Shot him dead for nothing. I knew then I'd either be like them, or I'd be done. I walked away, but the law caught up anyway. I served my time in Yuma, 18 months behind stone walls. When I got out, I swore I wouldn't ride with men like that again. The words carried no dramatics, no attempt to soften the truth. They were plain, stripped down, spoken like a man who had nothing left to hide. Clara felt a sting of unease. It was one thing to take comfort from his presence, another to learn he carried a past with blood and prison in it. But the listeners of this story, and Clara herself, needed to know, was he dangerous? Or had he changed? "You brought that here with you," she said quietly. "If any of those men come looking, they might bring it to my door." Daniel nodded, his expression grim but calm. "That's the truth. They drift. Some might still ride. If they come north, they might remember me. But I won't let them near your place. I've kept watch all these years for that reason, as much as any other." Clara studied him, her mind running through the choices she had. She could send him away now, keep her walls tight, avoid the risk. But deep down, she knew the reality. Danger could come whether Daniel was here or not. Outlaws had already proven that once. And the difference now was that she wasn't alone. "Show me the rifle," she said suddenly. Daniel blinked, surprised. "What for?" "I don't just want you standing watch," she said firmly. "If trouble comes, I need to be ready too." He regarded her for a moment, then nodded. Together they walked to the shed. Clara unlocked the chest where she kept her late husband's rifle, wrapped in cloth to keep dust from the barrel. She had cleaned it from time to time, but she hadn't fired it in years. When she handed it over, Daniel checked the chamber, the stock, the sights, moving with the same steady care he had shown fixing her door. "It's good steel," he said. "You've taken care of it." "I couldn't use it," she admitted. "But I couldn't let it rot either." He loaded a round, lifted it to his shoulder, then lowered it and handed it back. "Hold it firm against your shoulder, not loose. It'll kick." She followed his instruction, her hands stiff but steady, and aimed at the far fence. The weight of the rifle felt heavy, not just in her arms, but in her chest. She had carried grief for a decade, but this was different. This was a decision to defend, not just endure. Daniel stood close, but not too close, his voice calm, guiding. Breathe out before you squeeze. Don't fight the pull. Let it break when it's ready. She lowered the rifle, not firing, but the act of holding it, of standing with it, felt like something new. Clara realized the listeners might wonder, was she ready to fight again after all those years of hiding behind silence? She wasn't sure of the answer, but for the first time, she believed she could be. When she set the rifle down, she looked at Daniel and said, "If your past comes to my door, I won't run. Not again." He gave a small nod, the faintest flicker of respect in his eyes. For a long moment, they stood there in the open air, two people who had lost nearly everything, now bound by an unspoken pact. The quiet between them was no longer just survival. It was trust beginning to take root. The days after Clara first held the rifle passed in a tense kind of calm. The land itself gave no sign of danger. No broken fence lines, no missing stock, no stray hoof prints that shouldn't be there. Yet Daniel's watchfulness sharpened. He rode the ridges longer at dusk and checked the ground at dawn. Clara noticed the way his eyes scanned the horizon, how his hand stayed near the butt of his revolver even when nothing stirred but the wind. The listeners of this story would naturally ask, if he confessed to riding with rough men, would they return for him? And if they did, what would it mean for her? The answers began to show sooner than Clara expected. One evening, a freighter wagon stopped by her gate, its driver stepping down to water his team. He tipped his hat, then spoke in a careful voice. Couple riders asking after a haze. Said they was looking for him, heading north. Look to him. Clara felt her chest tighten. She had known this question would come. What if Daniel's past didn't stay buried? Daniel stood a few paces off, listening. His face didn't change, but his jaw set hard. Did they give names? He asked. The freighter shook his head. Scar on one's cheek, tall, thin. Other had a busted hand he kept wrapped. He paused, uneasy. Didn't sound like men looking for a friendly meet. When a wagon rattled on, Clara turned to Daniel. Her voice was low, but firm. They're coming, aren't they? He didn't lie. Maybe. They used to ride with the crew I left. If they're asking, they'll follow through. Clara's mind reeled with questions. Would the town stand with them this time? Or turn away like they had before? Could she trust Daniel's word that he wouldn't bring danger to her door? She forced herself to speak. Then we prepare. This is my home. I won't be chased off it again. The next morning, Daniel went into town. Clara stayed behind, nerves knotted in her stomach. When he returned, his expression was as grim as the freighter's had been. Deputy says he's heard the same. Men from the South. He doesn't want them stirring up trouble here. He told me, if they're mine, keep them off his streets. That evening, Clara and Daniel walked the property line together. They repaired the weaker spots in the fence, shifted the cow and calf to the inner corral, and stacked firewood near the porch in case they had to hold out. Clara felt her hands blister against the shovel, but she kept at it. Each strike against the earth was more than work. It was a decision not to give in. When the chores were finished, Daniel saddled his horse and looked toward the ridge. I'll ride the line tonight, he said. Clara stepped closer, the lamp light spilling across her face. And leave me here alone? He met her eyes, steady as ever. You won't be alone. I'll be close. Trouble won't reach you first. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and something she couldn't quite name. She realized the listeners, too, might be asking, was this man protecting her out of duty, guilt, or something deeper? Clara didn't yet know, but she felt her fear ease slightly knowing he would be near. That night, she kept the lamp low, saving oil, the glow barely touching the cabin walls. She sat at the table, rifle laid within reach, listening to the storm of cicadas outside and the creak of wood in the wind. Her thoughts circled what she had never admitted. She trusted him now, and that trust bound her fate to his whether she liked it or not. On the ridge, Daniel rode slow, his horse steady under him, eyes scanning the shadows where moonlight cut across the land. Every rustle in the brush made his hand tighten around the reins. Every gust carried the question of whether the men he once knew had finally found his trail. The night passed with no shots fired, no riders cresting the ridge, only an owl cutting across the pasture and vanishing into the dark. But the quiet didn't bring relief. It only marked the pause before whatever was coming. 2 days later, the waiting ended. Clara was carrying a bucket of water from the trough when she saw dust rising along the ridge. Too much for a stray rider, too deliberate to be travelers passing by. Her chest tightened, the bucket heavy in her grip. She set it down slow, careful not to spill, and called for Daniel, her voice sharper than she meant. He came out of the shed immediately, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes already fixed on the horizon. 3 men rode down the slope, moving slow, like they owned the land beneath them. One had a scar that split from his cheek to his ear. Another kept his right hand wrapped in cloth, resting it awkwardly on the reins. The third was younger, but his eyes carried the same mean hunger. Clara didn't need to ask who they were. The look on Daniel's face told her. They were the ones he had spoken of. The listeners of this story would wonder, would he face them alone? Would Clara stand back, or would she stand with him? Would the town turn away again, leaving her to whatever came? All of those questions hung in the air as the riders slowed near the fence line, their horses snorting dust. The man with the scar called out first, his voice carrying across the yard. "Well, if it ain't Hayes. Thought we'd find you hiding somewhere quiet. Didn't figure you'd play house with a widow." Daniel stepped forward, his shoulders loose, his hands at his sides. He spoke calm, no edge to his voice. "You rode far enough. There's nothing for you here. Turn around and ride on." The younger one laughed, sharp and thin. "We didn't come for the scenery. You walked out on your crew, Hayes. That don't wash easy." Clara felt her stomach clench. She remembered too clearly another group of men standing in her yard years ago, the night her husband died. The memory threatened to drown her, but she forced herself to breathe, forced her feet not to back away. She reached for the rifle leaning by the cabin door and stepped where they could see her, the barrel steady though her hands trembled. Scarface's eyes cut toward her, and his grin widened. "Well now, she's got steel in her hands. Maybe you taught her that, Hayes? Or maybe she's just desperate enough to try." Daniel's voice stayed level. "You want to settle with me? Then settle with me. Leave her out of it." But before the moment could tip further, the sound of horses came from behind. Clara's heart leapt, half in fear, half in hope. The deputy rode up slow, with 2 townsmen, rifles laid across their saddles. He raised his hand, not dramatic, but steady enough to shift the balance. "Afternoon, boys. Got word you drifted in. You got a choice. Ride on, or answer to warrants that say you're wanted 2 counties over." The riders shifted in their saddles. For a heartbeat, Clara thought they might push through anyway. Her finger hovered over the trigger, her breath caught in her throat. Then Scarface spit into the dust, a sharp, ugly sound. "Ain't worth it." He turned his horse, the others following with curses low under their breath. As they rode off, Clara's knees threatened to buckle. She forced herself to stand straight, rifle still in her grip. Daniel looked at her then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding hers. He hadn't flinched. Neither had she. The deputy gave a short nod. "We'll trail him out. See, they keep riding south." "But Hayes," his voice dropped, "keep your line clean. Don't give me reason to wonder." When they were gone, the yard fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that came after something dangerous had passed without spilling blood. Clara lowered the rifle at last, her arms heavy. Daniel stepped to her side, his voice low. "You didn't back down." She met his eyes, her chest still heaving. "Not again. Not ever." The listeners who might have doubted whether Clara could face the shadow of her past now had their answer. She wasn't the same woman who had buried her husband alone. She wasn't standing behind walls of silence anymore. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had carried his own past into her yard, and together they had faced what came for them. The yard looked calm again by the next morning, but Clara knew nothing was the same. The riders had been turned away, the deputy had left with his men, and the land had gone quiet, but the silence was not the same kind she had lived in for 10 years. This silence carried the memory of a choice she had made, standing with a rifle, refusing to back down, refusing to let her home be taken again. Listeners of this story would want to know, how did the town see her now? Would they still whisper behind her back? Or had something shifted after what they had witnessed? The answers revealed themselves in the days that followed. When Clara went to town later that week for more flour and sugar, the air inside the store felt different. The same two women who had whispered before now gave her curt nods, eyes sharp but not cruel. One even said, "Heard you held a rifle like you meant it." It wasn't quite respect, but it wasn't scorn either. Mr. Jensen, the clerk, didn't just fill her order. He slipped a small sack of peaches onto the counter and said, "On the house. You've earned it." Clara accepted without a word, though her chest tightened. For the first time in a decade, the town wasn't just treating her as the widow left behind. They were acknowledging her as someone who still stood. Daniel stayed quiet through it all, but Clara noticed the way his presence beside her no longer drew the same long stares. People looked, yes, but they didn't turn their backs the way they once had. It seemed that by facing down the riders together, they had crossed some invisible line in the eyes of the town. Still, another question remained, one the listeners of this story would naturally ask. What did Daniel truly want here? Was he staying only out of duty, or did he see a life with her? Back at the cabin, Clara decided she needed to know. That evening, while Daniel fixed a loose peg in the wall shelf he had built for her jars, she set the peaches on the table and cut them into neat slices. She placed a plate in front of him. "We can't keep going like this forever," she said plainly. "You watching me wondering. I need to know, are you planning to stay?" Daniel set the hammer down, looked at her with a steady gaze. For once, there was no hesitation in his voice. "I've stayed near you 10 years already. If you'll have me here, I'll stay the rest." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything left unsaid. The years of distance, the silence, the long wait for trust. Clara felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. She had braced for less, maybe even for him to tell her his time with her was only temporary. Instead, she heard a promise. That night, they walked to the edge of the cottonwoods where her husband's grave lay. The small cross she had set years ago leaned slightly, the wood weathered. Clara knelt, straightened it, and pressed the earth firm around its base. Daniel stood beside her, hat in his hands, quiet. She spoke softly, more to the grave than to him. "I kept this place for you, and for what was. Now I'll keep it for what is." Daniel didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but his presence at her side said enough. He wasn't there to erase the past. He was there to build with what remained. When they walked back to the cabin, Clara noticed the repairs he had done in small, quiet ways. The door swinging clean, the shelf holding jars, the fence lined straight. Her home no longer looked like a place patched together by grief. It looked like a place ready to stand for the years ahead. The listeners might still wonder, was this truly love, or just survival bound together? But Clara knew what mattered. Love wasn't in sudden fire or loud declarations. It was in the choice to remain when leaving would be easier. And Daniel had made that choice. The morning came clear, the kind of sharp light that made every board, every nail, every stone on the ground stand out, as if the land itself wanted to be counted. Clara stood on her porch with her hands clasped in front of her, watching the small group gather. The deputy was there, his ledger tucked under his arm. Mr. Jensen had come with his wife, who carried a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Even the two women from the store stood off to the side, whispering less now, more curious than critical. Listeners might have asked through the whole story, would Clara and Daniel ever step beyond silence? Would they remain just two people bound by circumstance, or would they claim something more permanent? That morning gave the answer. Daniel stood beside her, hat in his hands, his shirt clean but plain. He looked no different than he had the day he first stepped through her door, but there was something in the way his shoulders rested. Less weight, less waiting. The deputy cleared his throat, opened the ledger, and read the vows in a steady voice. To stay, to work, to keep faith. The words were not elaborate, not dressed up. They didn't need to be. Clara repeated them without hesitation, her voice firm though her hands trembled once. Daniel did the same, his tone low, the kind of voice that carried further than sound because it did not waver. When they signed their names in the ledger, Daniel's writing was sharp and deliberate, hers neat and practiced from years of keeping accounts. When it was done, the deputy nodded once and shut the book. For a moment the yard was quiet. Then the grocer's wife stepped forward and pressed the loaf of bread into Clara's hands. "A house ought to start with bread," she said simply. The boy who had come with them rang a small hand bell he had dug from a crate, the sound carrying across the open yard in a thin, bright line. After the witnesses left, Clara and Daniel worked side by side without speaking much. They pulled down the old fence that had once marked the gap between his land and hers, setting new posts so the two places joined. Daniel brought his few belongings from his cabin at the north draw: a worn blanket roll, a whetstone, a dented coffee pot. He set them inside her cabin, not like a guest leaving them in a corner, but like a man who meant to use them there. That evening, Clara organized her pantry on the shelf he had built. She placed the peaches Jensen's wife had given her at the center, their skins still soft, while Daniel led the cow to the fresh water he had dug from the creek line. She paused in the doorway, watching him in the low light. For years, she had guarded her ground with silence, but now the quiet carried something different. It wasn't the stillness of grief, it was the steadiness of two lives settled into the same place. Listeners who had followed from the start might still have lingering questions. Would the town accept them? Would the shadows of Daniel's past rise again? Would Clara's scars ever fully fade? The truth was plain. The town had already begun to shift. Neighbors who once whispered had stood to witness. Daniel's past had come riding and been turned back, the law itself making clear he was no longer a man to be hunted. Clara's scars would never vanish, but they no longer bound her to silence. As the sun dropped, they sat together on the steps of the porch. The swallows darted across the yard, chasing the last insects of the day. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, quiet. Clara sat beside him, the warmth of his presence closer than words. Neither felt the need to fill the space with talk. They had both lived long enough to know that staying meant more than speaking. When the lamp inside flickered to life, Clara looked at the cabin that had once held only grief. It now held tools, food, his coffee pot, and the sound of two people moving through it as if they belonged. She exhaled slowly, steady, knowing there were no questions left that mattered. The line Daniel had walked for 10 years, always at the fence, always just out of reach, was gone. In its place stood a home, not patched together by survival alone, but made whole by choice. And that was the end. A woman who had believed herself finished with feeling, and a man who had lived too long with regret, had stepped across the silence together. Not as watchers, not as ghosts of their past, but as two people who had chosen to stay.